Someone has to pay for this disaster. Those words hit me like a freight train as I sat across from my manager's desk watching him shuffle through the termination letters from our 3 biggest accounts. His eyes weren't even looking at me when he said it, just staring at those papers like they held the secrets of the universe. And that someone is you. I felt everything inside me crumble. 3 years. 3 whole years I'd poured my soul into building relationships with these clients. I knew their kids' names, their favorite coffee orders, the exact way they liked their quarterly reports formatted. I'd taken calls at midnight when their systems crashed. Worked through my own birthday to meet their deadlines. Learned their business better than some of their own employees. But Jerome, these clients never showed any signs of enough. He held up his hand like I was some annoying fly buzzing around his head. They specifically mentioned dissatisfaction with their account management. That's you. This is your mess. And frankly, I'm tired of cleaning up after your mistakes. My throat felt like sandpaper. The worst part wasn't even the accusation. It was how easily he said it. Like firing me was just another Tuesday task on his calendar. Hey everyone, I'm Delilah. I'm 28, and I guess you could say I used to be one of those people who believed hard work and loyalty actually meant something. Before I continue with what happened next, could you please take a few seconds to tell me in the comments where you're listening from? I want to know where my story is reaching, because what I'm about to share changed everything about how I see the world. And please, if this resonates with you, hit that like button and subscribe because I have a feeling you're going to want to hear how this ends. So there I was, getting fired for something that made absolutely no sense. These 3 clients, a tech startup that had grown from 5 employees to over 200, a family-owned manufacturing business that trusted me with their biggest expansion, and a nonprofit that credited me with helping them secure their largest grant ever. They'd all been happy just weeks before. Jerome stood up from his chair, already reaching for the cardboard box they keep in the supply closet for exactly these moments. Security will escort you out. You have 15 minutes to gather your personal items. 15 minutes to pack up 3 years of my life. But here's what Jerome didn't know. What nobody in that office knew. During the past 2 weeks, while I was frantically trying to understand why our client seemed suddenly distant, I'd been digging through account files looking for any hint of what went wrong. And I found something. Something that made my blood run cold. It started small. A billing entry for 6 hours of consultation when I knew the call had only lasted 2 hours. An additional service fee on an invoice that I'd never approved. At first I thought maybe it was just clerical errors. The accounting department had been swamped lately. But then I found another one. And another. Always small amounts. Always just under the threshold that would trigger a client inquiry. Someone was systematically inflating our bills, skimming money off the top of every single invoice. And they were doing it so cleverly that it looked like legitimate charges. The pattern was beautiful in its simplicity and disgusting in its execution. Extra consultation hours here. Mysterious processing fees there. Upgraded service packages that were never actually delivered. Individually, each overcharge looked like it could be a mistake. Together, they painted a picture that made me physically sick. Jerome was stealing from our clients. My clients, the people who trusted me. As I packed my personal photos and the little succulent plant my coworker Aisha had given me for my work anniversary, my mind was racing. The security guard, a sweet older man named Walter, kept apologizing under his breath as he followed me around. "This doesn't seem right, Miss Delilah," he whispered as I emptied my desk drawers. "You always treated everyone so nice." I managed to smile, even though I felt like screaming. "Sometimes things just don't work out, Walter." But inside, I was planning. Because I'd realized something that Jerome hadn't considered in his rush to make me the scapegoat. He'd been so focused on getting rid of me that he'd forgotten one crucial detail. These clients didn't just trust the company, they trusted me personally. And I had copies of everything. Not because I'd planned to expose anyone, but because I'm the kind of person who keeps detailed records. Every email. Every phone call summary. Every invoice discrepancy I'd flagged over the past months. I'd been building a file, trying to present Jerome with solutions to what I thought were innocent billing problems. Now, those files were about to serve a very different purpose. Jerome walked me to the elevator, his satisfaction practically radiating off him like heat from a stove. "Clean this up quickly," he told Walter. "I want all traces of this removed by end of business today." The elevator doors closed, and I saw my reflection in the polished metal. I looked broken. Defeated. Exactly how Jerome wanted me to look. But appearances can be deceiving. That night, I sat in my apartment with 3 manila folders spread across my kitchen table. Each one contained a complete breakdown of every billing irregularity I'd discovered for each client. Not accusations or theories, but pure data. Dates, amounts, service codes that didn't match actual work performed. I wasn't planning revenge. I was planning justice. The first call I made was to Cassandra, the CFO at the tech startup. We'd worked together for 2 years, and she'd always been straightforward with me about budget concerns and payment schedules. "Delilah," she sounded surprised to hear from me. "I heard about what happened. I'm so sorry." For what it's worth, the decision to change account management wasn't personal. "I know," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Actually, that's why I'm calling. I wanted to make sure you received some information that might be important for your financial records." I'd been careful about how I worded everything. I wasn't making accusations or trying to sabotage anyone. I was simply providing documentation that raised questions about billing accuracy, questions that any responsible business would want to investigate. "What kind of information?" Cassandra's voice had shifted into her professional tone. "Discrepancies in your recent invoicing that I noticed while reviewing account files. Nothing I was able to resolve before my departure, but I thought you should be aware of them for your own records." The beautiful thing about Cassandra was that she understood numbers the way I understood people. When I walked her through the patterns I'd discovered, she didn't need me to connect the dots for her. "Hold on," she said after I'd outlined the 3rd month of questionable charges. "You're telling me we've been paying for consultation hours that never happened?" "I'm saying there appear to be inconsistencies between the services documented and the services billed. You'll want to conduct your own review." "Of course." There was a long pause. Then, "Delilah, I need to ask you something directly. Are you suggesting someone at your company has been intentionally overbilling us?" I chose my words carefully. "I'm providing you with data that shows patterns you might want to investigate. What you do with that information is entirely up to you." After I hung up, I made similar calls to Marcus at the manufacturing company and Dr. Elizabeth Santos at the nonprofit. Same approach, same careful presentation of facts without editorial commentary. By the time I finished the 3rd call, it was nearly midnight. I felt exhausted but also strangely calm. Whatever happened next was out of my hands. I went to bed that night thinking about Jerome's face when he'd handed me that cardboard box. The certainty in his voice when he'd called it my failure. The way he dismissed 3 years of relationship building like it meant nothing. He was about to learn that relationships, real ones, built on trust and honesty, don't disappear just because someone gets fired. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls. The first voicemail was from Cassandra, and her voice was tighter than I'd ever heard it. "Delilah, we need to talk. Our accounting team worked through the night, and what we found is significant. Please call me back immediately." The second was from Marcus. His usually jovial tone replaced by something much sharper. "We've discovered some irregularities that we need to discuss with you and with your former employer." Dr. Santos's message was the most direct. "I've contacted our legal team. We need to meet today." But it was the fourth voicemail that made me smile for the first time in 48 hours. Jerome's voice, trying to sound casual but failing completely. Delilah, I need you to call me back. There seems to be some confusion with our former clients, and I think we should discuss how to handle this professionally. Confusion. That's what he was calling it. I didn't call him back. Instead, I called each of my former clients and arranged to meet with them individually, not as their former account manager but as someone who might be able to provide additional context for their investigations. The meeting with Cassandra's team happened first, in a conference room at their headquarters. She'd brought her entire financial leadership team plus someone I didn't recognize, who introduced himself as a forensic accountant. We ran a complete audit of 18 months of invoicing, Cassandra began, sliding a thick folder across the table toward me. What we found goes far beyond what you initially flagged. I opened the folder and felt my stomach drop. They discovered everything. Not just the small overcharges I'd noticed, but a systematic scheme that had been running for over 2 years. Phantom consulting sessions. Inflated hourly rates. Fictional rush charges for standard deliveries. The total fraudulent billing appears to be approximately $87,000, the forensic accountant said. Just from your account alone. $87,000 from one client. I thought about the other 2 accounts and realized we were talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars in theft. The interesting thing, Cassandra continued, is that all of these irregularities started appearing after a specific date, March 15, 2 years ago. I knew that date. It was exactly 1 week after Jerome had been promoted to department manager. We've also discovered that several of these fraudulent charges were reversed or credited back in small amounts, always with notations that they were approved by account management. Approved by you. My heart stopped. I never approved any of those credits. We know, she said gently. Because we have copies of all the documentation you sent us. Your signature was forged on the approval forms. Jerome hadn't just been stealing from the clients. He'd been setting me up to take the fall if anyone ever discovered the scheme. The meeting with Marcus revealed an even more elaborate setup. Not only had similar overbilling been happening, but Jerome had apparently been telling him that I was the one requesting rush charges and premium service fees. He'd positioned himself as the reasonable manager trying to control his overeager account representative. He actually called me 3 weeks ago, Marcus told me, his face red with anger, to apologize for what he called your aggressive billing practices. Said he was working on reining you in. By the time I met with Dr. Santos, I understood the full scope of what Jerome had done. He'd created a system where he could steal money while simultaneously building a case against me. Every forged signature, every fraudulent charge, every fake approval was designed to point back to me if anyone started asking questions. He'd planned to destroy my career to cover his crimes. But there was one thing Jerome hadn't planned for, something that was about to make his careful scheme completely backfire. All 3 clients had kept detailed records of every interaction they'd had with me, every email, every phone call, every meeting. And those records told a very different story than the one Jerome had been crafting. They showed an account manager who consistently questioned unusual charges, who always sought approval for any service upgrades, who had actually been protecting their interests rather than exploiting them. More importantly, they showed that I'd been flagging billing irregularities for months, asking Jerome to help me resolve what I thought were accounting errors. You were trying to stop this, Dr. Santos said as she reviewed my email trail. You've been essentially investigating this fraud without even knowing it. That afternoon all 3 clients did something unprecedented. They jointly requested a meeting with Jerome and the senior leadership at my former company, not to discuss contract renewals or service issues but to present their findings about systematic fraud and to demand a complete external audit. I wasn't invited to that meeting, but Cassandra called me afterward to tell me what happened. Your former manager walked into that conference room expecting to discuss damage control, she said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. Instead, he found himself facing forensic accountants from 3 different firms, legal representatives, and documentation of criminal activity spanning 2 years. Apparently, Jerome had tried to maintain his position that the billing issues were the result of my poor management and that my firing had been necessary to protect client relationships. That strategy lasted exactly 7 minutes. The moment we presented evidence that your signatures had been forged, Cassandra continued, and that you'd actually been the one trying to report these discrepancies, his whole story fell apart. But the most beautiful part, the detail that made everything perfect, was what happened when the senior leadership asked Jerome to provide his own documentation to defend himself. He couldn't because every piece of evidence he could have used to support his claims had been created using fraudulent paperwork. Every forged signature, every fake approval, every manipulated billing record was actually proof of his guilt rather than mine. Jerome had spent 2 years building the perfect trap, and then he'd walked right into it. Within 6 hours of that meeting, he'd been terminated and escorted out by the same security team that had walked me out 2 days earlier. The company had also called the district attorney's office to report potential criminal activity. But the story doesn't end there, because my former clients weren't finished. That evening I received a call from the company's president, a woman named Catherine Rodriguez, who I'd only met twice during my 3 years there. "Delilah, I owe you an enormous apology," she began. "We terminated an exemplary employee based on false information, and we'd like to discuss how to make this right." What she proposed wasn't just reinstatement. It was a new position with expanded responsibilities, a significant salary increase, and direct oversight of the new billing compliance department they were creating in response to the fraud they discovered. More importantly, all 3 clients had made it clear that their decision to continue with the company was contingent on my return. They wanted me personally managing their accounts with contractual guarantees that I would be their primary point of contact. "They trust you," Catherine said. "And frankly, after reviewing what happened, we understand why." I thought about Jerome, probably sitting in some lawyer's office, trying to figure out how his perfect scheme had destroyed his career instead of mine. I thought about how easily he'd discarded 3 years of my work. How confident he'd been that he could erase me from these relationships I'd built. He'd forgotten something crucial about trust. Real trust, the kind built through honest communication and genuine care, doesn't disappear when someone gets fired. It transfers. It follows the person who earned it. And sometimes that trust becomes the very weapon that destroys the person who tried to exploit it. But this is only half the story, because what happened after I returned to work was even more shocking than the fraud itself. The investigation Jerome's scheme triggered uncovered something that changed not just our company but the entire industry. If you want to hear how deep this really went and what happened when the authorities started digging into Jerome's background, tell me in the comments that you're ready for the rest. Because what we discovered about him, about how long this had been going on and about the other people he destroyed along the way, it's going to make you question everything you think you know about workplace loyalty. And please, while you're deciding whether you can handle the rest of this story, hit that like button if you believe that sometimes the truth has a way of surfacing exactly when it's supposed to. Subscribe if you think that people who abuse their power always eventually create their own downfall. Because what happened next proved that sometimes the universe has a sense of justice that's more perfect than anything we could plan ourselves. 3 weeks into my new role, I was sitting in my upgraded office when Catherine knocked on my door with a look that made my pulse quicken. "We need to talk," she said, closing the door behind her. "The FBI wants to meet with you." FBI. Those 3 letters made everything real in a way that company meetings and termination letters never could. Turns out, when you report financial fraud involving multiple businesses and hundreds of thousands of dollars, federal investigators take notice. But what they discovered about Jerome went far beyond what any of us had imagined. Agent Patricia Henley was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and the kind of presence that made you want to tell her everything immediately. She sat across from me in the conference room with a file that was easily 2 in thick. "Ms. Rivera," she began. "We've been investigating Jerome Whitman for the past 18 months. My breath caught. 18 months. That meant they'd been watching him long before our clients discovered the fraud. You're not his first victim, she continued, opening the file to reveal photographs of 4 other people. 2 women, 2 men, all around my age, all with the same hollow expression I'd probably worn when I got fired. These are former employees from his previous companies, all terminated under similar circumstances, all blamed for client losses that were actually the result of systematic fraud. She slid the photos toward me and I studied their faces. There was something familiar about their expressions, a kind of defeated confusion that I recognized from my own reflection during those first few days after getting fired. Jerome has been running this same scheme for over 6 years across 4 different companies. He gets promoted to a management position, identifies the most dedicated account managers, then uses their relationships to build fraudulent billing schemes. When the theft gets too obvious, he destroys the employee's reputation and disappears. The room felt like it was spinning. How many people? 7 that we know of. You're number 8. Except you're the first one who fought back. Agent Henley explained that Jerome's pattern was almost identical each time. He'd target employees who had strong client relationships, use their access to create billing fraud, then systematically build a case against them while positioning himself as the vigilant manager trying to control a rogue employee. The genius of his approach, she said, was that he always made sure the employee looked guilty, forged signatures, false documentation, carefully crafted conversations with clients that painted his victims as greedy or incompetent. But there was something else, something that made my stomach turn. In each case, the employee's termination was just the beginning. Jerome would then contact their industry connections, spreading stories about their alleged misconduct. He destroyed their professional reputations so thoroughly that most of them left the field entirely. I thought about Isabella Martinez, whose photo showed a woman with kind eyes and a genuine smile. Agent Henley told me she'd been a rising star in marketing consulting until Jerome framed her for inflating campaign budgets. She now worked at a grocery store because no one in her industry would hire her. Then there was David Chen, a brilliant financial analyst whose career ended when Jerome made it look like he'd been skimming client accounts. He'd moved to another state and changed careers entirely, becoming a high school math teacher. What happened to me, I said slowly, was supposed to be the beginning, not the end. Exactly. Jerome's mistake was choosing someone whose clients were willing to investigate rather than just walk away. Agent Henley showed me recordings from Jerome's previous companies, hidden camera footage of him forging signatures, phone recordings of him lying to clients about employee behavior, email trails showing how he'd systematically destroyed careers to cover his tracks. The pattern was so consistent that we'd actually predicted his next move. We knew he'd try to pin the blame on his most trusted employee when the scheme got too obvious. You knew this was going to happen to me? We suspected, but we needed evidence, and we needed him to make a mistake. Your client's investigation gave us both. The investigation had uncovered something even more disturbing. Jerome hadn't just been stealing money and destroying careers. He'd been selling client information to competitors, using his access to confidential business data to run a side business that had netted him over $500,000 across 6 years. Every employee he destroyed was also a potential witness to his other crimes. By ruining their credibility, he made sure no one would believe them if they ever tried to expose him. But Jerome had made one crucial error in his pattern: he'd gotten greedy. In previous companies, he'd kept the fraud small enough to avoid triggering major investigations. But your clients were bigger accounts, and the amounts he was stealing kept growing. Plus, he'd started getting sloppy. Agent Henley showed me evidence that Jerome had been using company credit cards for personal expenses, charging luxury hotel stays and expensive dinners to client accounts, even buying a boat that he'd somehow categorized as a client entertainment expense. He was planning to leave the company within 6 months anyway, probably to start the whole process over somewhere else. You were supposed to be his final scapegoat, taking the blame for everything while he moved on to his next victim. The depth of his plan was breathtaking in its cruelty. He'd been setting me up for over a year, carefully documenting fake instances of poor performance, creating false client complaints, even planting evidence in my work files that would support his eventual accusations. He had a whole exit strategy, Agent Henley explained. Blame you for the fraud, get hired by a new company based on his successful management of a difficult situation, then start the cycle over again. But what broke my heart was learning about the other victims, not just the employees he'd destroyed, but the small businesses whose trust he'd exploited, the non-profit organizations whose limited resources he'd stolen, the family companies whose growth he'd stunted with his theft. One non-profit had actually closed down after Jerome's fraud was discovered, unable to recover from the financial damage. A family business had laid off 12 employees because they couldn't afford payroll after discovering the extent of his billing manipulation. Jerome Whitman isn't just a white-collar criminal, Agent Henley said. He's someone who systematically destroys lives and livelihoods for personal gain. The legal proceedings moved faster than I expected. With 7 victims willing to testify and documentation spanning 6 years, Jerome's defense attorneys had very little to work with. He'd been so confident in his system that he'd kept detailed records of everything, apparently planning to write a book about his experiences in corporate consulting. Those records became the prosecution's primary evidence. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and I testified for 2 full days. Sitting in that witness stand, looking at Jerome in his expensive suit, I felt something I hadn't expected, pity. Because I realized that someone who spends their entire career destroying other people's lives is probably destroying their own soul in the process. Jerome looked hollow, empty, like someone who'd forgotten how to be human. But my pity disappeared when I heard Isabella Martinez testify about how Jerome's lies had cost her not just her career but her marriage. Her husband had believed the accusations about her integrity, and their relationship couldn't survive the suspicion and financial stress. David Chin talked about the depression that followed his firing, how he'd spent 2 years believing he was a failure, questioning his own memory and integrity because Jerome's documentation had been so convincing. Another victim, Rebecca Torres, described how Jerome's scheme had cost her custody of her daughter when she couldn't find work in her field and fell behind on child support. Her ex-husband had used her professional misconduct as evidence that she was unfit to parent. Jerome had destroyed families, not just careers. The day of sentencing, I was sitting in the courtroom when the judge delivered the verdict, 15 years in federal prison, plus restitution payments to all victims and affected businesses. The judge's words still echo in my head. Mr. Whitman, you have systematically betrayed the trust of employees, clients, and employers for your own financial gain. You have destroyed careers, damaged businesses, and caused immeasurable personal suffering. This court finds your actions to be particularly egregious because they were planned, deliberate, and repeated despite multiple opportunities to change course. 15 years. It felt like justice, but it also felt like too little for the lives he damaged. But the most beautiful part came after the trial ended. The 7 victims who testified had stayed in touch throughout the proceedings, supporting each other through the legal process. We'd formed an unexpected family, bound together by shared experience and mutual understanding. Isabella decided to start her own consulting firm using the skills Jerome had tried to bury. David discovered that his teaching career was actually more fulfilling than finance had ever been, and he'd been promoted to department head. Rebecca had not only regained custody of her daughter but had also started a nonprofit helping other parents navigate similar situations. We all healed, but we healed together. My own company implemented new oversight procedures that became a model for other firms in our industry. Catherine asked me to lead a task force developing best practices for fraud prevention. And my recommendations were adopted by the professional association that governs our field. But the change that meant the most to me was personal. My 3 major clients didn't just renew their contracts, they referred us to other businesses, specifically requesting that I handle their accounts. Word spread about what had happened, and instead of damaging my reputation, Jerome's scheme had actually enhanced it. People wanted to work with someone who'd stood up to fraud, someone who'd put integrity above personal safety. My client base tripled within 6 months, and I was promoted to regional director with my own team of account managers. Sometimes I think about that day when Jerome handed me the cardboard box. When he looked at me with such certainty that he'd won. He was so sure that he could erase 3 years of relationship building. So confident that power and position were more important than truth and trust. He was wrong about everything. The relationships I'd built weren't just business partnerships. They were human connections based on respect and honesty. When someone attacks those connections, they don't disappear, they transform into something stronger, something that can't be destroyed by lies or manipulation. Jerome's biggest mistake wasn't the fraud itself. It was believing that he could use people's trust as a weapon against them. He thought loyalty was weakness, that caring about clients was a vulnerability he could exploit. Instead, it became the foundation of his downfall. Today, I run a department of 15 people, all account managers who understand that our job isn't just managing business relationships, it's protecting them. We've created a culture where questioning irregularities is rewarded, where transparency is valued above everything else. And every new employee gets the same orientation speech from me. Your clients trust you with their success. That trust is sacred. Anyone who tries to exploit it, whether they're a colleague, a manager, or even a company executive, is your enemy, and we will fight them together. Jerome is about 8 years into his sentence now. I don't think about him often, but when I do, I hope he's learned something about the real cost of betraying trust. Not just the legal consequences, but the spiritual emptiness that comes from building a life on other people's destruction. The 7 of us who testified against him still meet every year on the anniversary of his sentencing. We call it our Phoenix Day because we all rose from the ashes of what he tried to do to us. We share updates about our lives, our careers, our families, and we remind each other that surviving someone else's cruelty doesn't make us cruel. It makes us stronger. If you've made it this far in my story, I want you to know something important. If you're dealing with someone who's trying to destroy your reputation, your career, or your relationships, don't give up. The truth has a way of surfacing, especially when people who care about you are willing to look beyond the lies. Trust your instincts, document everything, and remember that real relationships, the ones built on honesty and mutual respect, are stronger than any scheme designed to destroy them. Please, if this story resonated with you, if it gave you hope or courage or just reminded you that justice sometimes does prevail, hit that like button. Subscribe to my channel because I'll be sharing more stories about standing up to workplace bullies, building authentic professional relationships, and never letting someone else's cruelty define your worth. Comment below and tell me about a time when you refused to let someone else's lies become your truth. Share this story with anyone who needs to hear that sometimes the people who try to destroy us end up creating the exact circumstances that reveal their own destruction. Because the most powerful revenge isn't something you plan or execute. It's something you allow to happen by refusing to compromise your integrity, even when everything seems stacked against you. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for believing that truth matters, that trust is sacred, and that people who abuse their power will eventually face the consequences of their choices. Remember, you are stronger than anyone who tries to break you. Your integrity is more powerful than their lies. And your future is brighter than they could ever imagine.